10 ancient structures beneath the Kimberley no one can explain deep, in the remote wilderness of Western Australia's Kimberley region, where red sandstone country meets ancient tidal channels and the wet season floods a landmass larger than Germany, something has been waiting. For decades, explorers who pushed into this largely inaccessible landscape came back with stories that did not fit the accepted timeline of human history. Structures carved into cliff faces that predate any known civilization on the continent. Geometric arrangements beneath floodwaters that align with a precision no improvised tool should have achieved. Rock chambers sealed for thousands of years, cracked open by earthquake shifts, revealing painted walls that show figures no one in the archaeological community can fully account for. The Kimberley is one of the most geologically ancient landscapes on Earth. Parts of its bedrock are over 3.5 billion years old. But what sits beneath its surface, inside its canyon walls, and scattered across its flooded tidal river systems, tells a story that goes far beyond geology. A story that science is only beginning to piece together, and one that northwestern Australia has kept hidden from the wider world until very recently. These are 10 ancient structures beneath the Kimberley that no one can fully explain. If you are finding this journey through the Kimberley's hidden past as compelling as we do at Loving Wallaby, subscribing to the channel keeps you connected to the stories the Australian landscape is still telling. Hit the subscribe button now and the notification bell so that the next deep dive into Australia's ancient history comes straight to your feed. Number 1. The Guon Guon figures and their impossible makers. In the early 1890s, a pastoralist named Joseph Bradshaw was pushing cattle through the rugged interior of the Kimberley Plateau when he came across a rock face covered in painted figures, unlike anything he had seen. Tall, slender, elaborately decorated human forms dressed in tasseled ceremonial garments, with headdresses, armbands, and body ornaments rendered in extraordinary detail. Bradshaw wrote in his journal that the figures bore no resemblance to any Aboriginal art he had encountered anywhere in his years of travel across northwestern Australia. The figures became known as Bradshaw paintings, and later, at the insistence of the Ngunnawal people, they were renamed Guon Guon, after the small finch believed in oral tradition to have created them using its own blood as pigment. The local Aboriginal communities, whose traditions stretch back tens of thousands of years, do not claim to have made these paintings. They attribute them to another people from another time whose identity has been lost to the deep past. Modern dating attempts have placed some of the Guon Guon figures at over 50,000 years old, which would make them among the oldest representational art found anywhere on the planet. But precise dating remains contested. The ochre pigments that might allow radiocarbon analysis have been replaced over millennia by wasps' nests and microbial communities that colonize the paint surface, making accurate dating almost impossible. What researchers can say with confidence is that the style and sophistication place these figures in a category entirely separate from the rest of Australian rock art traditions. The elegant, elongated forms painted on sandstone overhangs across the Kimberley Plateau remain, decades after their rediscovery, essentially without a satisfactory explanation. Number 2. The Wandjina cave complexes and the eyes that watch. If the Guon Guon figures raise questions about who made them, the Wandjina paintings raise questions that go considerably deeper. Found across hundreds of sites in the central and northern Kimberley, Wandjina are depicted as large oval-faced beings with enormous dark eyes, no mouths, and radiating halos of light surrounding their heads. They float against white-painted backgrounds inside rock shelters positioned at precise compass orientations, placed where fresh water emerges from ancient limestone beneath the plateau surface. The Moanjim people, traditional custodians of country near Derby in the West Kimberley, describe the Wandjina as creators of the land, sky, and sea, ancient beings who arrive from clouds and cyclones, and who remain actively present inside the paintings. Disturbing a Wandjina site is understood to have direct consequences for rainfall and the health of the country. Researchers have noted that many Wandjina sites are positioned precisely at geological fault lines and aquifer discharge points, suggesting a knowledge of the landscape's subsurface hydrology that would require sophisticated surveying and multi-generational observation. The element of the Wandjina complexes that most puzzles outside researchers is the deliberate modification of the cave chambers themselves. Rock surfaces have been smoothed, Drainage channels have been cut into cave floors to prevent wet season flooding. Narrow passageways in some complexes connect chambers in sequences described as intentionally designed to shape and amplify sound. When acoustic testing was conducted inside certain Wandjina chambers in the Gibb River country, the resonance produced at specific vocal frequencies was described as physically overwhelming. Whether that effect was deliberately engineered or is a coincidence that ancient inhabitants learned to use is a question that current research has not resolved. Number 3. The Montgomery Reef subsurface formations. Montgomery Reef sits off the Kimberley coast near Raft Point, and at low tide, it does something that appears to defy common sense. As the tidal water drops, the reef seems to rise from the ocean, water cascading from its surface in dozens of natural waterfalls, as though the land itself is pushing upward through the sea. It is one of the most photographed tidal phenomena in Australia, visited by tourists on float planes and Kimberley coastal cruise vessels each year. But beneath the reef's famous surface, something considerably stranger has been documented by marine researchers diving the subsurface channels along its eastern face. At depths ranging between 6 and 20 metres, there is a series of flat stone platforms and constructed channel walls that do not match the surrounding natural coral and limestone formations. The platforms are composed of a different stone type to the reef material around them, and several of the surfaces carry what a marine scientist described as tooling marks, linear grooves cut across the stone at regular intervals, consistent with deliberate shaping. If those platforms were constructed by human hands, they would have to date to a period when sea level along the Kimberley coastline was dramatically lower than today. The coast is known to have been dry land as recently as 10 to 12,000 years ago, when the last ice age kept global sea levels approximately 120 metres below their current position. Ancient Aboriginal oral traditions from this coast describe ancestral times when the sea was far away and the land, now submerged beneath the Indian Ocean, was inhabited country. The Montgomery Reef formations may represent physical evidence of that oral memory, but no systematic excavation has been conducted, with marine archaeologists pointing to a lack of funding and the severity of tidal conditions as obstacles to proper investigation. Number 4. The Mitchell Plateau Stone Circles. The Mitchell Plateau in the northern Kimberley is accessible only by four-wheel drive along a dirt track that closes entirely during the wet season from November through April. When the plateau reopens after the rain, the flat basalt tableland forming its upper surface emerges from months of isolation, with its ancient landscape essentially unchanged. It is here, above the Mitchell Falls, that a series of stone arrangements have been identified by travellers and researchers over the past 3 decades, arrangements that appear in no official heritage register, and whose existence is known primarily through the accounts of station workers and independent researchers. The largest arrangement reported by multiple independent witnesses consists of a series of stone circles, each measuring between 4 and 8 metres in diameter, clustered across an area roughly the size of 2 football fields. The circles are built from dark basalt cobbles, covering the plateau surface, and several appear to be deliberately oriented toward astronomical events, with gaps in the circle walls aligning to the rising and setting positions of the sun at the summer and winter solstices. Researcher Philip Clark, who has published on Aboriginal astronomical knowledge in Northern Australia, notes that similar stone arrangements found elsewhere on the continent have been formally linked to sophisticated celestial observation. The Wandjina arrangement in Victoria is now accepted by mainstream archaeology as an ancient astronomical site. The Mitchell Plateau circles may represent an equivalent tradition in the Kimberley, but the plateau's extreme remoteness and the cost of getting research equipment to its surface have meant that the circles remain, for now, entirely outside the formal archaeological record. Number 5. The horizontal waterfall underground channels. The horizontal waterfalls of Talbot Bay are among the Kimberley's most celebrated natural spectacles. Massive tidal forces push billions of litres of seawater through 2 narrow gaps in the Montgomery Range, creating what appears to be a waterfall running sideways, a churning wall of water that boats can ride only at specific narrow windows in the tidal cycle. How the falls form is well understood. What is far less understood are the submarine passages that extend from the base of the Montgomery Range cliffs into the surrounding seabed. Divers who have entered these passages describes several as having floor surfaces that do not match the surrounding natural rock. Flat, smooth, and running in straight lines for distances, suggesting deliberate shaping rather than erosion. One passage entered by a university dive team was found to contain a series of stone blocks fitted together without visible mortar, extending for approximately 11 meters before the passage narrowed beyond safe diving depth. If those fitted stone blocks are genuine structural elements, their presence beneath the tidal waterfalls would suggest construction during a period of dramatically lower sea level, consistent with occupation of this coastal zone at the close of the last ice age. The Kimberley coastline during that period would have been an entirely different landscape, with the Montgomery Range forming an inland ridge rather than a tidal feature. What those passages were used for, and by whom, are questions that the violent tidal conditions inside the waterfall channels make extremely difficult to safely investigate. Number 6. The Cockburn Range Rock Gallery. The Cockburn Range forms the long eastern wall of the Pentecost River Valley in the eastern Kimberley, a dramatic series of red sandstone escarpments rising from the flat savanna of the Gibb River country. The range is well known to travellers who photograph the cliffs at sunrise, when the morning light turns the stone from amber to deep red. But the cliff face contains a gallery of rock engravings that most road travellers, moving through the valley below, never see. The engravings extend across a 2-kilometre section of the cliff face at heights between 3 and 15 metres above the base of the escarpment. They include geometric patterns, concentric circles, deeply incised horizontal lines running up to 8 metres across the stone face, and several panels that appear to show schematic representations of river systems or coastlines rendered from a bird's eye view, a cartographic convention that Western scholarship has historically been reluctant to attribute to ancient Australian visual culture. Researcher Robert Bednarik, who has spent decades studying Australian rock art, argues that some of the Cockburn Range engravings may represent one of the oldest cartographic traditions documented anywhere on Earth. He dates certain panel styles using microerosion analysis to periods exceeding 100,000 years. Though this dating method remains vigorously contested, what is not contested is that the engravings are complex, purposeful, and produced by a culture with a sustained interest in representing the landscape at scale. Who that culture was and what became of it remains a genuinely open question. Number 7. The Drysdale River Cave Markings. Drysdale River National Park covers a vast and largely unvisited section of the northern Kimberley. At several points along the Drysdale's tributary creeks, cave systems open in the cliff walls above the waterline. The great majority of these caves have never been formally surveyed. The few that have been entered by researchers contain formations that have generated significant disagreement among the specialists who have seen them. The most documented cave system in the Drysdale drainage is referred to informally by park rangers as the Grid Cave, named for the geometric pattern covering its interior walls. Running from the cave entrance to a depth of approximately 40 metres inside the limestone formation, the walls carry parallel lines cut into the rock at regular intervals, creating a grid that covers most of the available wall surface. Between the grid lines are symbolic markings, repeated shapes, and grouped patterns that do not correspond to any documented artistic tradition from the Kimberley region. The cave was first entered by a park ranger in 2003, who described his reaction in a regional newspaper as one of complete disorientation. He said the markings looked less like art and more like a recording system, as though whoever made them was keeping account of something across a very long period of time. The cave was reported to the Western Australian Department of Environment and Conservation. A brief survey was conducted in 2005, and the report recommended further investigation but allocated no resources for it. The Grid Cave has not been formally studied since, and what was documented inside its walls remains in a brief departmental report that most researchers in the Kimberley field have never read. Number 8. The Bungle Bungles Hidden Chambers. The Bungle Bungles, known to Purnululu National Park's traditional custodians by their older name Purnululu, are among the most visually striking landforms in Australia. The great beehive-shaped sandstone towers rise from the Ord River Valley, in clusters covering roughly 45,000 hectares, their striped orange and black surfaces, the result of alternating layers of silica crust and dark cyanobacteria. They are a UNESCO World Heritage Site visited by thousands of tourists each year who walk the narrow valley floors threading between the towers. But the interior of the Bungle Bungles formation conceals spaces that most visitors will never find. Several of the larger domes contain interior voids accessible only through narrow fissures at ground level. And within these spaces, researchers from the University of Western Australia documented what appear to be intentionally modified surfaces. In one chamber reached through a narrow fissure in the central dome cluster, a floor area of approximately 30 square meters has been leveled and smoothed, a process requiring the deliberate removal of substantial amounts of sandstone material. The chamber walls carry faint linear markings, and acoustic testing inside the space reveals a standing resonance at low frequencies that makes the interior vibrate at specific vocal pitches. Whether this chamber was shaped by ancient inhabitants using Pernalulu as a shelter, a ceremonial space, or something else is not established. What is established is that the sandstone of the Bungle Bungles is geologically fragile. Any significant human intervention in the rock would require carefully sustained effort, and the leveled floor of this interior chamber represents a meaningful amount of deliberate physical work. The question of whose work it was and what it was done for has not been answered. Number 9. The King George River Canyon Chambers. The King George River, in the remote northwest of the Kimberley, drops over the edge of the ancient plateau in two spectacular falls before entering a narrow gorge carrying it to the Timor Sea. The canyon walls rise to over 80 meters in the deepest sections. Expedition cruise ships anchor at the canyon entrance, so passengers can travel upriver to view the falls. The King George River Gorge is one of the most photographed natural spectacles in Western Australia. What cruise passengers do not see are the chambers carved high into the canyon walls above the waterline, accessible only by rope from the plateau above or by technical climbers approaching from the river. Several of these high wall chambers were first documented by a film crew shooting aerial footage of the gorge in 2009. The footage showed what appeared to be a series of openings in the canyon wall at a consistent elevation, spaced at roughly equal intervals, extending for several hundred meters along the south-facing cliff. A climbing team that reached 3 of those chambers in 2011 found that each had been modified in the same consistent ways. The floor of each chamber had been leveled. The opening of each had been shaped to a consistent width. And in each chamber, the smooth, curved wall surface facing out over the canyon toward the Timor Sea caught and focused the light of the setting sun on the same day of the year, the day of the autumn equinox, concentrating it to a bright point on the back wall. Whether that solar alignment across multiple separate chambers was intentional is debated. Whether it could plausibly be coincidental is a considerably harder argument to make. Number 10. The Prince Regent River Carved Platforms. The Prince Regent River flows north through a steep-sided gorge carved through the ancient plateau of the northwest Kimberley before opening into the King Sound tidal system. The gorge walls are so steep that travel away from the river itself is practically impossible across most of its length. It is one of the last genuinely unexplored river systems in Australia, a gorge that even today has been fully traversed by only a handful of documented expeditions. It was during one of those expeditions, a survey conducted by the Kimberley Foundation Australia in 2014, that the carved platforms of the Prince Regent were first formally noted. At 3 separate locations along the gorge, the survey team identified flat stone surfaces sitting approximately 1 to 2 meters above the river's high water mark that showed consistent signs of deliberate shaping. The surfaces had been cut back from the gorge wall, creating platforms between 2 and 5 meters wide, looking directly down onto the river channel below. The back wall of each platform carried carved designs, and the platform edges showed wear patterns consistent with long-term use as a standing or seating surface. The platforms are positioned at the 3 points where the gorge walls close most tightly together, narrowing the river passage to within 30 meters from cliff face to cliff face. These are the natural choke points where anyone traveling the river by water would be most exposed. The depth of the carving represented sustained construction effort across a considerable period, and the carved designs on the back walls have not been matched to any recorded tradition in the existing Kimberley documentation. The next comprehensive survey of the river has not been funded. Until it is, the platforms sit above the dark water in the silence of a gorge that almost no one reaches. What all 10 of these sites share is a quality of unexpectedness. They do not fit the story archaeology has told about who lived in this part of Australia when they lived here, and how sophisticated their relationship with this ancient country truly was. The researchers who have spent serious time with these structures consistently return with the same observation. The longer you look at the Kimberley, the more certain you become that we have been underestimating this landscape and the people who shaped it for a very long time. The Kimberley has been continuously inhabited for at least 65,000 years, and possibly considerably longer. What those tens of thousands of years of occupation built and left behind in the red rock country of northwestern Australia is a question that deserves far greater resources than it has received. These 10 structures are an argument, made in stone and pigment and shaped rock, for a richer and more complex Australian prehistoric culture than any textbook currently describes. The Kimberley has been telling that story longer than we have been alive to hear it. The question is whether we are ready to listen.